March 23rd, 2007, 0347 hours, 30 miles northwest of Baghdad. Chief Warrant Officer 2, Sarah Chen, had 8 minutes before 2 soldiers bled to death in her cargo bay. But the sandstorm outside her Black Hawk had just dropped visibility to 0. Command had ordered her to divert to fly 40 minutes to an alternate base. The soldiers didn't have 40 minutes. They had 8, maybe less. So Chen did something no pilot was authorized to do, something her instructor had called the stupidest thing I've ever seen. She switched off her radio, ignored the direct order, and prepared to land a 15-ton helicopter in 0 visibility using a technique that didn't exist in any flight manual. What Chen was about to attempt landing without being able to see the ground sounds impossible, and according to standard operating procedure, it was. If you lose visual reference, you divert. You don't cowboy it into the ground at a forward operating base surrounded by concrete barriers and cell towers. But Chen had been preparing for this moment for 6 months. She'd practiced something in secret, something other pilots thought was bizarre. She'd learned to land a helicopter with her eyes essentially closed, feeling her way down through vibration and control feedback. The question was, could she do it in an actual sandstorm, with 50 lives depending on her, when 2 of those lives were measured in minutes? Sarah Chen was not born to be a pilot. She grew up in Modesto, California, the daughter of a transmission shop owner and a Walmart cashier. Her father, David Chen, could diagnose a failing clutch just by pressing his ear to the transmission case and listening to metal grinding at specific RPMs. "Feel before you think," he told her when she was 12, teaching her to change fluid in a '94 Honda Accord. "Your instruments tell you what happened. Your body tells you what's happening." That lesson seemed irrelevant at the time. Sarah graduated high school in 1997 and took a job operating a printing press. She dated a guy from the John Deere dealership. She figured she'd marry him, have kids, eventually run her father's shop. Then 9/11 happened. She wasn't consumed by rage or flag-waving patriotism. She just felt that sitting still was wrong. So at 22, with no college degree and no particular skills beyond fixing transmissions, she walked into an Army recruiter's office in Modesto. They needed helicopter mechanics. She enlisted in January 2002, but Sarah Chen didn't want to maintain helicopters. She wanted to fly them. Her instructors were skeptical. She was older than most students. No college. Average flight aptitude scores. But she studied rotor aerodynamics until 0200 every night. She memorized emergency procedures. She lived in the simulator. And then she started doing something strange. During maintenance flights at Fort Rucker, she'd practice landing with her eyes closed. Not fully closed, she'd block out the windscreen with a makeshift curtain and rely only on her instruments. Then she'd descend slowly, feeling for the moment the landing gear touched down. Why? She was teaching herself to recognize the subtle change in vibration frequency when the wheels made contact, the barely perceptible shift in collective resistance, the way the aircraft settled differently on concrete versus dirt. Other warrant officers thought it was bizarre. "What the hell are you doing, Chen? Training to be a blind pilot?" She never explained. She'd just say, "Trying something," and continue. Her instructor pilot, CW4 Marcus Brandt, caught her doing it once in 2005. He watched her land on the Fort Rucker practice pad with her scan locked on instruments, never looking outside until the wheels touched. "That," he said after she shut down, "is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. If you lose visual reference in the real world, you divert. You don't cowboy it into the ground." "Yes, sir," Chen said. She kept practicing anyway, because something her father had taught her about transmissions applied to helicopters too. Machines transmit information through vibration, through control feedback, through subtle changes in how they handle. You just had to learn to feel it. By March 2007, Baghdad had become a killing ground for helicopters. The surge and additional 20,000 troops flooding into Iraq was underway. FOB Falcon, a sprawling logistics base in southern Baghdad, served as a critical medevac hub. But the spring Shamil season brought dust storms that could shut down flight operations for hours or days, and insurgents knew it. Al-Qaeda in Iraq timed ambushes to inflict maximum casualties during the golden hour, that first 60 minutes after injury, when trauma care determined survival. Helicopter pilots faced an impossible calculus: fly in marginal weather and risk crashing, or wait for conditions to improve and risk soldiers bleeding out. Standard operating procedure was clear. If visibility dropped below 1,000 meters, you diverted. You did not attempt to land. The risk of spatial disorientation, of flying into obstacles, was too high. But that night, Fob Falcon was the only location with a combat surgeon. The alternate bases had physician assistants who could stabilize wounds but couldn't operate. And the two soldiers in Chen's cargo bay, Specialist James Kowalski, 23, from Ohio, and Sergeant First Class Raymond Torres, 31, from Texas, had taken AK-47 rounds through their abdominal walls. They were bleeding internally. They needed surgery, and they needed it in the next 15 to 20 minutes. 0347 hours, 18 miles from FOB Falcon. The caution panel lit up first, engine inlet temp rising, sand particles choking the turbine intakes. Then the horizon disappeared. The city lights of Baghdad, normally a sprawling orange glow, vanished behind a curtain of dust so thick it looked solid. The helicopter shuddered. 40-knot winds carrying particulate matter that hammered the windscreen like hail. Chen's co-pilot, CW-2 Daniel Park, keyed the radio. Falcon Tower, Black Hawk 7-2. We're IMC. Request vectors for emergency divert. Negative divert, Chen interrupted. Park stared at her. Behind them, over the intercom, the flight medic's voice was tight. Torres is crashing. Pressure's 80/50 and dropping. Time, Chen said. Maybe 15 minutes. Maybe less. Chen did the math. 40 minutes to the alternate. These men would be dead before they landed. Park was already pulling up the divert procedure. Chen, we can't land in this. We have zero viz. We'll hit a tower, a building. I can land in zero viz, Chen said. What? I've done it 100 times. Different technique. Park's eyes widened. You mean not approved? I mean it works. From the TOC, the operations officer's voice crackled. Black Hawk 7-2, Falcon Tower. Weather at your destination is below minimums. You are directed to divert. Chen switched off the radio. Park's jaw dropped. Did you just... I did. Chen began her descent. I need you to call out altitude in 50-foot increments. Do not touch the controls. Understood? Park hesitated. Behind them, someone was groaning in pain. The sound of tearing packaging. The hiss of oxygen. Staff Sergeant Eric Ramsey working frantically to keep Torres and Kowalski alive. Understood, Park said quietly. Chen keyed the internal intercom. Ramsey, strap in. This is going to get rough. We're already rough back here. It's about to get rougher. So, what exactly was Chen about to do? The technique she'd practiced for 6 months was called proprioceptive landing, though that wasn't an official term because it wasn't in any official manual. It was something she'd developed herself, based on her father's transmission diagnostics, trusting physical sensation over visual input. The theory was simple. A helicopter transmits information through vibration and control feedback. When the landing gear is 5 feet off the ground, the rotor wash interacts with the surface, creating ground effect, a cushion of compressed air that changes rotor efficiency. You can feel it in the collective, that slight decrease in upward pressure needed to maintain altitude. When the wheels are 2 feet off the ground, the landing gear begins sensing proximity through the oleos, the hydraulic shock absorbers in the landing struts. You can feel it in the cyclic as subtle changes in how the helicopter responds. Most pilots relied on visual cues, seeing the ground approach, judging distance with their eyes, flaring at the last moment. But Chen had trained herself to feel the landing instead of seeing it. The problem was, she'd never done it in actual zero visibility. She'd practiced with instruments only, but always with the option to look outside if something went wrong. Now, there was nothing to look at. The windscreen showed only brown chaos. The landing lights illuminated nothing but swirling dust, and the stakes were higher than they'd ever been. If she misjudged altitude by more than 5 feet, she'd slam into the landing pad hard enough to collapse the gear and rupture the fuel cells. If she misjudged her ground track, she'd drift into the concrete barriers surrounding the pad, destroying the tail rotor. If she descended too fast, She'd enter vortex ring state, an aerodynamic condition where the helicopter falls through its own rotor wash and becomes uncontrollable. 50 lives. 2 of them measured in minutes. 1 chance to get it right. Altitude 500 feet. Park called. Chen reduced airspeed to 60 knots. Forward speed was dangerous now. Without ground reference, she needed to transition to a hover while still high enough to make corrections, then descend vertically onto the pad. But hovering in zero visibility was nearly impossible. A helicopter in hover is inherently unstable. Pilots rely on visual reference points to detect drift. In zero viz, spatial disorientation happens within seconds. Chen couldn't rely on her eyes. She had to rely on something else. She lowered the collective slightly. The helicopter settled, descending at 300 feet per minute. Through the cyclic, she felt the control response changing. In forward flight, inputs are sluggish. As airspeed decreases, the helicopter becomes more responsive, more twitchy. At 40 knots, the response sharpened. At 20 knots, it became almost immediate. She was entering translational lift transition, the regime between forward flight and hover. This was where most pilots crashed in poor visibility. Altitude 300 feet, Park said. Chen applied gentle left pedal, correcting for wind drift. The helicopter yawed 5 degrees. She centered the cyclic, felt the aircraft settle into a shaky hover. Airspeed bleeding off. 15 knots, 10 knots, 5. The helicopter shuddered, caught in rotor wash and wind shear. Right cyclic, forward cyclic, slight collective increase to arrest descent. The control inputs were measured in millimeters. Too much, and she'd overcorrect, lose control entirely. Altitude 200 feet. Chen focused on her hands. The cyclic transmitted information through her palm, tiny vibrations, subtle resistance, the way the stick wanted to drift in certain directions. She wasn't fighting the aircraft. She was listening to it, feeling what it wanted to do, making small corrections to guide it toward the landing pad she couldn't see. She lowered collective. Descent rate increased to 400 feet per minute. The turbine noise changed pitch. Dust hammered the windscreen so thick now it sounded like hail. Her father's voice in her head. Feel before you think. Your body tells you what's happening. Altitude, 150 feet. The helicopter dropped through a wind shear. Chen felt it through the collective's sudden loss of lift, the aircraft sagging. She added power, stabilizing. Her breathing was slow, controlled. Altitude 100 feet. Ground effect would appear soon. She'd feel it as a subtle cushion. That would tell her she was close. But how close? 5 feet? 10 feet? She reduced descent rate to 200 feet per minute. Slower now, methodical. Altitude, 75 feet. Behind her, someone was praying in Spanish. Ramsey was shouting at tourists to stay with him. The cargo bay smelled like blood and diesel and dust. Altitude, 50 feet. Chen felt it. A subtle change in the collective. Slightly less upward pressure needed to maintain altitude. Ground effect, but weak, still too high. Altitude 40 feet. The cushion strengthened, rotor wash compressing against something solid, but she had no idea if it was the landing pad or the taxiway or the maintenance area or the concrete barriers. She had to trust her training. She'd memorized the GPS coordinates. Her heading was correct. Her approach vector was correct. If she'd maintained position during the hover, and she believed she had, she was directly over the pad. But belief and certainty were different things. Altitude, 30 feet. This was the danger zone. Too high to abort safely. Too low to make major corrections. Chen focused on the landing gear. The oleos would compress slightly as the helicopter's weight began settling. She'd feel it as a subtle change in how the aircraft responded. A slight, settling sensation. Altitude, 20 feet. The helicopter shuddered. Wind gusts from multiple directions. Turbulence created by the landing pad itself, disrupting airflow. Left cyclic. Forward cyclic. Back cyclic. She wasn't thinking anymore. She was reacting. Altitude 15 feet. She felt the landing gear enter the rotor wash boundary layer. The oleos sensing proximity through the compression wave of air being pushed down by the rotors. Subtle. Barely perceptible. But she'd trained herself to recognize it. Altitude, 10 feet. Almost there. She reduced collective slightly. The helicopter settled faster. 2 feet per second. The vibration frequency changed. The sound changed. She could hear the rotor wash hitting the concrete pad now, a dull roaring underneath the turbine whine. Altitude 5 feet. This was it. Everything depended on the next 2 seconds. The landing gear touched. Left wheel first, then right. The oleos compressed. The helicopter settled onto the concrete with a firm thud. The full weight transferred from the rotors to the landing gear. Chen reduced collective to flight idle. They were down. Altitude 0, Park said quietly. We're on the ground. Chen's hands were shaking. She realized she'd been holding her breath. She exhaled slowly, her grip on the controls still tight. Park was staring at her. How the hell did you— Tell the tower we're down, Chen said. Get a ground guide to the cargo bay. The cargo bay doors opened. Medics in full body armor emerged from the sandstorm, flashlights cutting through the dust. They pulled the first litter. Torres, unconscious, his uniform soaked with blood. Then Kowalski, pale but conscious, gripping the medic's hand. Ramsey jumped down, looking back at Chen through the open cockpit door. He didn't say anything, just nodded once. The other 48 soldiers disembarked in groups of 4, moving quickly toward the medical tents. Chen watched them vanish into the brown haze. She'd carried them through a sandstorm using a technique that didn't exist in any flight manual, using skills she'd practiced in secret because no one believed they had value. Park finally spoke. Chen, that was— He paused, searching for words. That was the most insane flying I've ever seen. Chen didn't respond. She was thinking about her father, about pressing his ear against a transmission case, eyes closed, listening to metal grinding against metal. Tower's asking how you did it, Park said. They want to know how you landed with 0 visibility. Tell them I followed procedure, Chen said. 6 hours later, Torres and Kowalski were out of surgery. Torres had lost his spleen and part of his large intestine. Kowalski had a perforated bowel and a nicked femoral artery. The surgeon, Major Rachel Winters, told the investigating officers that both men would have died if Chen had diverted to the alternate base. They had maybe 10 minutes left, Winters said. 15 at the outside. The investigation lasted 3 days. Chen was grounded, pending review. She sat in a prefab office at FOB Falcon and answered questions from a CW-5 who'd flown Apaches in Desert Storm, and a full-bird colonel who'd never flown helicopters but was responsible for aviation safety. You turned off your radio, the colonel said. Yes, sir. You disobeyed a direct order to divert. Yes, sir. You attempted a landing in conditions that were explicitly below minimums, using a technique that is not approved, not taught, and not in any standard operating procedure. Yes, sir. The colonel looked at the CW-5. The CW-5 looked at Chen. Walk me through it, the CW-5 said. How you did it, step by step, Chen explained. The proprioceptive technique, the training she'd done at Fort Rucker, how she'd practiced for 6 months, teaching herself to land using tactile feedback instead of visual reference, how she'd memorized the feel of ground effect, the compression of the landing gear oleos. The CW-5 listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. That shouldn't work, he said finally. It did work, Chen replied. The colonel leaned back in his chair. You understand that if we approve this, if we say what you did was acceptable, we're opening the door for every cowboy pilot in theater to try something similar. Sir, with respect, what I did wasn't cowboy flying. It was a trained technique executed under controlled conditions. Controlled conditions, the colonel repeated. You call 0 visibility in a sandstorm controlled conditions? I call methodical execution of a practiced skill. Controlled. Yes, sir, the CW-5 spoke up. She saved 50 lives. 2 of them would be dead right now if she'd followed procedure. And if she'd crashed, the colonel said, 50 would be dead. But she didn't crash, the CW-5 said. The colonel looked at Chen for a long moment. Then he signed the paperwork. You're cleared to fly. No formal reprimand. But Chief Chen, if you ever turn off your radio again. Yes, sir, Chen said. Understood. But here's what no one expected. 3 weeks later, a UH-60 from the 101st Airborne attempted a similar landing during a dust storm near FOB Speicher. The pilot had heard about Chen's landing through the NCO network. He tried to replicate her technique. He crashed, killed himself, his co-pilot, and 12 soldiers in the cargo bay. The investigation was brutal. They wanted to blame Chen. They wanted to say she'd inspired reckless behavior, that her unauthorized technique had led to copycat attempts. But when they reviewed the crash, they found something different. The pilot hadn't trained. He'd simply heard about landing by feel and attempted it with no practice, no understanding of ground effect or oleocompression, no methodical approach. He'd been flying too fast, descending too steeply, and he'd entered vortex ring state at 40 feet AGL. He never had a chance. The investigation cleared Chen of culpability, but it raised a different question. If proprioceptive landing could work, should it be taught formally? The answer, from the aviation community, was no. Too risky, too difficult to standardize, too dependent on individual pilot skill. Better to maintain strict weather minimums and divert when conditions deteriorated. But quietly, very quietly, the technique was studied. CW5 Marcus Grayson, the same officer who'd investigated Chen's landing, wrote an internal report titled Alternative Landing Techniques for Degraded Visual Environments. He referenced Chen's technique without naming her. He outlined the theoretical basis, the training requirements, the risks and benefits. The report circulated through the Directorate of Evaluation and Standardization at Fort Rucker. Some instructors dismissed it. Others were intrigued. A few began experimenting during maintenance flights, practicing landings with reduced visual reference, feeling for ground effect, learning to read the helicopter through control feedback. It never became official doctrine. It was never added to the flight manual. But among experienced pilots, especially those who deployed multiple times to Iraq and Afghanistan, a certain skill became valued, the ability to land when you couldn't see the ground. They didn't call it proprioceptive landing. They called it pulling a chin. And every once in a while, when weather closed in and soldiers needed medevac, a pilot would key the radio and say, "I'm going to try something, Chen style." Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but the technique existed now, passed down through the informal network of warrant officers and NCOs, a piece of tactical knowledge that wasn't in any manual, but was understood by those who needed to know it. After her deployment, Sarah Chen returned to Modesto, California. She left active duty in 2009, took a position with the California Army National Guard, and flew search and rescue missions in the Sierra Nevada mountains. She married a high school teacher named Michael Ortiz. They had 2 kids. She worked part-time as a flight instructor at a small airport in Turlock, teaching private pilots how to handle their Cessnas in crosswinds and low visibility. She never spoke much about the Sandstorm landing. When asked, she'd say, "I just did what had to be done," and change the subject. She didn't keep her medals on display. They were in a drawer in the bedroom, underneath old tax returns and expired passports. In 2019, at age 40, she was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. She fought it for 2 years. She died in November 2021 at age 42, in a hospice in Modesto, surrounded by her husband and children and her father, who held her hand and told her she'd been the best transmission mechanic he'd ever trained. Her obituary ran 6 lines in the Modesto Bee. It mentioned her Army service and her work as a flight instructor. It didn't mention Fob Falcon or the 50 soldiers or the Sandstorm landing. There's a small memorial plaque at the Turlock Airport where she taught. It reads, CW2 Sarah, Chen U.S. Army, Instructor Pilot, 1979 to 2021. Most people walk past without noticing, but every spring, on March 23rd, a group gathers at the airport. They're older now, men and women in their 40s and 50s, some with gray hair, some with grandchildren. They were the 50 soldiers in the cargo bay that night. Or they were medics who treated Torres and Kowalski. Or they were pilots who learned to pull a Chen during their own deployments. They don't make speeches. They don't have ceremonies. They just gather quietly at the plaque, drink coffee from paper cups, and remember the pilot who landed in zero visibility using a technique that shouldn't have worked but did, because she'd trained for 6 months in secret, practicing something everyone said was impossible, trusting her hands more than her eyes, feeling the helicopter tell her what her instruments couldn't. There's a temptation to think that wars are won by generals and strategy, by firepower and logistics, by the big decisions made in the Pentagon and the White House. But the truth is, wars are decided by moments, by a pilot in a sandstorm, landing a helicopter she can't see, trusting skills she practiced in secret, saving 50 lives because she understood something her instructors didn't. That sometimes the instruments lie, and the only truth is what your hands can feel through steel and hydraulics and vibration. Sarah Chen didn't win the war. She didn't change the strategic situation in Iraq. She didn't stop the insurgency or prevent the next attack. But she saved 50 people. 2 of them, Torres and Kowalski, went on to have children of their own. Those children have children now. The ripple effects of that single landing, that 8-minute descent through a sandstorm, have propagated through decades, through families, through lives that wouldn't exist if Chen had followed procedure. And sometimes, in the calculus of war and humanity, that's everything. Would you have followed orders and diverted, knowing 2 soldiers would die before you landed? Would you have trusted a technique you'd practiced in secret, risking 50 lives on your own judgment? Would you have turned off the radio and descended into zero visibility, using nothing but feel? What shocked you most about this story? That the technique worked? That it led to a copycat crash? That the army never officially adopted it? That Chen died so young, her story mostly forgotten? Let us know in the comments below. If you believe that history is made not just by those who follow the rules, but by those who understand when the rules must be broken, share this with someone who needs to hear about Sarah Chen. Because sometimes the courage to trust your training, even when everyone says it's impossible, is the only thing standing between life and death. Because sometimes silence is louder than thunder, and sometimes one pilot is enough.